Welcome to today's masterclass, the first one for 2022. My name is Jose Rivera. I am the CEO of CSIA, and for today, I'll be your host. In case you don't know about CSIA, we are a global non-profit trade association with over 500 members in 35 countries. For system integration members, the CSIA Best Practices Manual and CSIA certification are among the most popular member benefits, but you will also enjoy a variety of others, including professional development, learning from your peers, and access to professional services experts, including insurance, financial, and legal, who understand the system integrator's unique business needs. For partner members, CSIA offers an ecosystem to grow your system integration programs, understand your customers' pain points, monitor industry trends, and share your thought leadership. With thousands of qualified integrators and suppliers, the CSIA Industrial Automation Exchange helps system integrators, industry suppliers, and manufacturers connect and do business. For system integrators and partners, it provides a platform to support your content and search engine optimization marketing efforts. Position yourself as a thought leader and nurture prospects during their complicated buyer's journey. In case you aren't a current member or haven't renewed your membership, the current time is great to join or renew. Membership provides you many benefits, including discounted registration rates for our in-person CSIA Executive Conference scheduled for 27th to 30th, 2022 in Denver, Colorado. I would like to remind you that we use the chat function to do our networking and providing our input, but real questions for the presenters should go into the Q&A box. The presenters will get to your questions at the end of their presentation. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Gloria and Jeff Forbes. Welcome. Gloria, you're mute.
You would think after all this time, right? Sorry about that. So today we're going to talk about a very timely subject, something that's on everyone's mind, and that is, what does the future workforce look like? And with the change to so many employees being remote, what impacts that has on your business, on the health and welfare of your employees, and what additional risks are a lot of firms picking up with the idea of having these remote workforces. So, background information from a background, environment. COVID has obviously had an exacerbation of this issue, but for a long period of time, we have been gradually adding more and more remote workers to our workforce. There are some advantages to that. Often it is hard to find specific talents in your geography. And while you might want to expand and increase your workforce with those talents and that knowledge and that expertise, it might be hard to do so. Diversifying your workforce geographically allows you to bring those employees into your company and allows you to expand your operations into those areas. And today, it might be hard to find people who want to work within an office environment. Many people are very happy working remotely and not being in an office environment. Some of the advantages of that is, the fact that your workforce and your, excuse me, I don't know what happened there. You'll have to, hold on one moment. My computer is giving me a little trouble this morning, more so than myself. Let me try this again. not taking me to the slideshow again. We had a little bit of this trouble in practice session. I do apologize for that. And my second screen is working with difficulty. If I need to, I will do this without presentation screen, without being in presentation mode. So as not to belabor the point, and I apologize for that. So again, the fact that your office environment I cannot. It's amazing that we do this and we practice, and then I don't know why this is happening. I can't get this up.
You can also maybe take it out of the presentation mode and just
I
show.
am, yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Absolutely, okay, I'm going to share. Are we back? We're at least back to this. Everyone can see this, and I will go from here. The opportunity to reduce costs, have smaller office spaces, less build out of equipment. Those items are beneficial from the standpoint of having remote work as well. So, you know, we talk about remote work. Remote work can be both hybrid and fully remote. Hybrid workforce does not represent anywhere near the challenges that you see in a fully remote environment. And fully remote can be local and working remote, or geographically diverse. You could have employees in multiple states. That environment is the most challenging and the area where we see most of our risks. So we're going to talk today and break our session into dealing with the risks, the challenges, talking about both the advantages and disadvantages of remote workforce. We'll do a little bit on compliance and legal issues that are faced, and we will talk about productivity, health, and welfare as well.
So what are the risks of working in remote environments and fully hybrid environments? As we go through this, I'll try to note specifically where we're talking about risks that are mostly applying to fully remote situations, situations where you have employees in different states you've never worked before, versus what are the risks that apply in hybrid or, you know, remote but local situations. So one of the biggest things we're seeing is issues with regulatory compliance. You know, if you've been a fully local office for your entire existence, but because of changes in workforce that have happened over the past 2 years, all of a sudden you're employing people in different states that you've never even worked in before, you know, maybe never even had a customer in or anything like that. It's going to present a whole host of different challenges your company hasn't faced before. You're going to have to start getting business licenses and paying taxes in states you've never worked in before, making sure unemployment insurance is getting paid, payroll taxes are getting paid, things of that nature. That's drastically going to increase some of the paperwork burden and some of the burden on your human resources people. And that's going to present some challenges you haven't faced before. A lot of customers we've talked to who are in this situation have started shifting toward more use of automated payroll companies to handle a lot of this extra burden for them. And that's certainly an option that's out there, and that can take some of this burden off you and put it on someone else. But obviously there are costs associated with that. There are big issues with regulatory compliance when you're moving between different states on things like labor laws. Different labor laws labor law can vary significantly from one state to the next. A good example of this is the state of New York has a non-occupational disability requirement. Employers in that state are required to provide this insurance for their employees. If you've never had an employee in the state of New York before, you might not be aware of that. You might not be purchasing that insurance, and all of a sudden you're out of compliance with the law and can be facing fines and things of that nature if the issue gets brought up. A lot of employers choose to use things like non-compete provisions in their employment agreements, but different states treat non-compete agreements very differently. Some states, they're enforced very aggressively, and they take a very pro-employer view towards non-compete agreements, and they're going to uphold them and enforce them pretty strictly to their terms. Although every state has their own definition of what's reasonable in that state. Other states, thinking specifically of California, have very strong public policy provisions against the enforcement of non-compete agreements. So, they're going to require much more time limitations in a non-compete agreement, much smaller geographic limitations in a non-compete agreement. And so if you're trying to use a sort of form employment contract with your employees, and all of a sudden you're hiring, 2 or 3 remote employees in California, you've got to be aware that some provisions in that employment contract aren't going to get enforced in California the way they would if you are, primarily in Arizona, for example. You can include choice of law provisions, to try and get around some of these areas where labor law might not apply to an employment contract in the same way. But again, some states are not going to enforce that choice of law provision. If you've got an agreement saying your choice of law for this employment contract is in Arizona, but you've got an employee who works 100% of the time out of California, California is not going to enforce that choice of law provision any more than they're going to enforce the non-compete provision if it violates their laws and their public policy. Some other good examples, wage and hour laws can vary significantly from state to state. With integrators, we don't necessarily talk to people who they think of the bulk of their workforce being hourly employees, but you still might have a few who are on the administrative side of things. So minimum wage, overtime requirements, things of that nature might vary significantly from state to state when they apply. And we have seen just nationwide in the past year and a half, a large increase in the number of insurance claims for wage and hour violations, and also in just straight lawsuits for those law violations. I'd also like to touch here on the Americans with Disabilities Act and how that can impact the way companies implement both remote and hybrid workforces. So the American with Disabilities Act does prevent discrimination in employment based off disability. And what it really requires you to do is make reasonable accommodations for disabled people given the nature of the work that they have to perform. So when we think about how this applies to a remote workforce, we're not concerned about how it might apply to someone installing a heavy piece of equipment on a customer job site. But if you are allowing remote work for an employee who is in a different state, and then that's sort of how you hire them, and at the same time you're trying to enforce a come to the office policy for local employees, and you have a local employee who doesn't want to come in to the office because they're claiming, for example, some disability or medical condition they have makes them more susceptible to COVID. If that claim winds up in court and you're trying to sit there and say, well, it wasn't a reasonable accommodation to let this person work from home, well, they now have the ability to say, well, you've let all these other people work from home. And the fact that they're in a different geographic location from me, when all we're doing is sitting at a desk, at a computer, logging into a network, it's going to be harder to argue that that's not a reasonable accommodation if you're allowing it for some people. So it's important to think through these issues when you are crafting your policies and procedures and making decisions, to hire people and making your decisions about whether you're going to be hybrid or whether you're going to be remote. These policies and procedures have to be applied in a way that's going to be non-discriminatory. And if you're going to let some people work from home and you're going to deny that opportunity to others, you have to be really, really solid on your reasons for doing so. Differences in geography alone probably aren't going to be enough once someone brings in a medical reason why they want to be a work from home employee. And these are, that's one that's going to apply whether you're, trying to say hybrid or local remote or, geographically dispersed remote. If you've got some employees you're letting do this, regardless of the reasons, you want to make sure those policies are going to be applicable to everyone in your office, everyone who works for you, and that where you do make divergences from those rules, you want to have really crystal clear reasons for doing so. I also want to talk about workers' compensation insurance and the impact that hybrid and remote workforces can have on your workers' compensation. First part of that is if you're hiring employees in different states, you have to make sure they're added to your workers' compensation policy, that those new states and new work locations, even if it's just someone's home address in a different state, is added to that policy. If your policy is only covering the state of New York for workers' compensation, and you've hired an employee who's working out of Oklahoma, that's not going to, it's going to violate both Oklahoma law in terms of making sure you have workers' compensation for your employees in that state, and also put you out of compliance with the terms of your workers' compensation policy. When we're talking remote employees, with our programmers, engineers, they're not normally the category of people we're super concerned about when it comes to workers' compensation. They tend to have very low workers' compensation insurance rates. They're far less likely to have a high payout on a claim. And most of that's just because they're high wage employees. So workers' compensation is never going to compensate them that well because most workers' compensation laws have pretty strong wage caps in terms of how much you can get paid out. But that doesn't mean it's not an area of concern at all. When we're talking about some of these potential work from home environments and how they can impact workers' compensation. In the past 5 to 10 years, there's been a real shift in workplace culture for a lot of companies where they're a lot more focused on making sure someone's working environment is ergonomically sound. And the main goal there is avoiding repetitive stress injuries, things like carpal tunnel syndrome, the type of injuries that can be caused by people not having good posture while they sit at their desks. So there's been a real move to more ergonomically friendly chairs, standing desks, things of that nature that are really supposed to reduce the incidence of those types of injuries and lead to a healthier workforce. As you move to a work from home environment, you lose a lot of that control that employers used to have. You're probably not buying standing desks for your employees to have in their homes. You're not buying their chairs. Maybe you are, and good for you for doing that, but I don't think that's standard across the American workforce or even amongst our integrator clients. So these are things that used to be a thing that people were addressing, and now that we're moved to a work from home or a hybrid environment, you're losing some of that control as an employer over your employees' working environment, so you can't address these issues in the same way you used to be able to. So that's an increased risk from where you were 2 years ago when everyone was coming into the same office to do a lot of this work. So it's something you got to be aware of, and it's something, you might want to think about, are there ways as a company we can start to address this in a way that we hope can head off some of these concerns. Maybe we need to do the occasional session where we're talking to employees about things like their posture, things like when they work from home, are you making sure they're getting up and moving around instead of just sitting in the same chair for 3 hours, which is not something people do as often when they're in a work environment. One other thing I want to talk about here is a major thing we've seen with people shifting to work from home environments, whether it's remote or hybrid. The hours employees are working are changing significantly. It's not just, come in at 8, leave at 5. You might sit down to your desk at 8, work till 11, get up, get a few things done around the house, come back, and sort of the trade-off for that, maybe you're taking an hour off in the middle of the day to exercise or do some household chores, is you're coming in, and since you're fully set up to work from home, maybe you're putting in an extra hour or two, at 7 or 8 p.m. This poses a few risks, and one of them is related to the wage and hour stuff I'm talking about. If you've got hourly employees and they're putting in extra hours late at night, does that implicate overtime, things of that nature? But it also has some interesting impacts on workers' compensation, because workers' compensation is meant to cover occupational injuries that occur while someone is working. If someone's working from home, at 8 p.m., and they get up and they trip over their own rug while going to get a cup of coffee before sitting back down to work. If that happens in an office environment, that would be an injury that would be covered by workers' compensation. There's definitely an argument now that if someone's in a work from home environment and something like that happens, that's an occupational injury. It's an injury that occurred while they're working, basically. And the fact that they're taking a 5-second break to get them a cup of coffee probably isn't going to transform that into a non-occupational injury. As an employer, this poses some real concerns because you don't have a lot of control, again, over someone's home environment. You can't really do a whole lot to prevent those types of injuries. Again, with high-paying employees, it's probably not our biggest concern, but it's something you need to be thinking about, and it's something that needs to be where reasonable sort of part of policies and procedures. What are you doing to limit the possibilities of these types of injuries occurring while someone is technically on the job? Understanding that there's really hard limits on what you can do in that type of situation.
So I think we're going to shift the conversation now to the, talking about productivity and then the health and welfare of employees as we engage with people that are working remote. And, particularly when you start the conversation about productivity, you've got those pluses and minuses associated with it. You will hear people say, I'm so much more productive working remotely than I am having to go to the office. I don't have to drive to the office. That's extra time that I'm working. I'm putting in more hours that way because I'm working remotely. I do that, as Jeff mentioned, back into the office, maybe 7, 8 o'clock in the evening. And so you're getting more from me than you did before. The other challenge to that is, productivity isn't just hours. Productivity is, quality of work. Productivity is also the, creativity associated with your work. And sometimes we're ignoring that piece of, day in, day out in the same environment without any change. And what happens from a standpoint of, burnout and fatigue. And so, again, in an office environment or, where you are engaged and there's other staff, there is less boredom often. There is less, when we talk about fatigue, more often in this environment, we're talking about emotional fatigue more so than physical fatigue. But again, sitting in a chair for long hours of time, many hours without that, getting up and having conversation, engagement with other staff can increase physical fatigue as well. When we are working from home now, we're still working in it's hard to believe we're still working in a COVID environment, but to a large extent we are. There are still surges and things of that sort that create distractions, such as children not being in school and being at home, so that you've got that remote education happening in your household at the same time as your remote work is happening. And those distractions can impact productivity in a large way. Managing remote employees, how are you measuring them? When are they on the clock? In some environments, it doesn't matter, if they turn themselves into, third shift employees or they're working during the day. But in some environments, that's not acceptable because there's customer service, the idea that you have to be available to others, that impact that clock, and how do you measure? And the engagement issue and communication issues are probably the strongest area and the most challenging area. How do you keep people engaged with your company and with other employees? What are you doing from a communication standpoint? We want to make sure that the people that work for us, know who they're working for. They operate within our culture. They represent us the way we want to be represented. And if you have people who had worked for you for a number of years and they go remote, well, that's a little easier to deal with. But when you hire someone new, how do you keep them engaged? What are you doing to train them? What are you doing from a development standpoint? How do you integrate them with your culture? How do they learn to deal with not just someone else that might be on a team with them, but other employees in your organization? And what, kind of a change to the way you're working is necessary to keep them moving in the direction that you want to. Obviously, if you hire remote employees, you're not doing it to turn them over consistently. You want to be we like to talk about best practices. You want to be an employer of choice. You want to engage in best practices for your remote employees. And what does that mean? And so over time, we talk about employee welfare and employee well-being. Many of us have employed or installed wellness and fitness and into our employee benefit plans, trying to have a positive impact from nutrition, lifestyle, and exercise, because that creates a healthier workforce. And we have installed a lot of of those engagement activities into our workforce, into our office, or our environment. Maybe it's not we've replaced the vending machine with all kinds of candy and snacks with fruits that are supplied, or we promote exercise, we promote a lifestyle. We engage people and say, get up from your desk, take a walk, ergonomically stretch your body in a way that is going to provide a better fitness style for you. And this has an impact on the cost of our employee benefits. Trying to keep our employees engaged and monitor their well-being. It has an impact on our employees themselves. And it has an impact on the engagement that we have with them. And so again, how do we interact with that when employees are fully remote and not, engaged in our activities on a daily basis. And managing that takes, a very different style than the way we would manage it if our employees were visible and with us at all times. So, we will talk a little bit about, we've talked to some of our integrators about how are they engaging with employees to help this and what challenges they have. But, we talk about, keeping those people engaged, keeping those people in conversation and communication with the other staff, and, games, video chats, and all kinds of activities are being utilized to try to have people that are working remotely engage with other remote workers, engaged with in-office workers, engaged with people that are not in their departments. They might be working on a project and speak with 2 out of your 100 employees all the time, okay, but they may not ever, speak or have any interaction with, the other 95. So promoting that is it takes a focus. And we like to talk about it as process as opposed to project. So many of us in this transition to remote work have rushed to say, oh, how are we going to deal with this? And we're going to have a meeting and we're going to have everybody on it, and everyone's going to go around the room and everyone's going to tell, they're going to make a statement of, give us something about you that we don't know. And, we'll have meetings like that. And for 2 or 3 months, everybody is engaged in doing this activity. And then it sort of like dies out. And, in integrating the remote workers became a project and not process. So it doesn't happen consistently. It's treated as if, oh, it's a task we have to complete. And now we've completed it. We integrated those people. Everything's fine. But it doesn't really work that way. And so we did reach out to several of the integrators that we have relationships with that are in our program. And we looked at a few people that had over the year added, suddenly, they had all their payroll in one state. And over the year, we've seen, I need to add the state of Illinois. I need to add the state of Georgia. I need to add, the state of Utah. And you look at that and say, they're adding a lot of remote workers. So we reached out to them to see, what their challenges were, what they were doing to integrate their employees into their workforce. And we thought that we would share some of those issues with you today. So Jeff, if you'd like to kind of talk a little bit about some of them.
One thing that everyone who responded stressed is just the importance of communication, especially with remote employees, but even with the employees who aren't remote but are going to be interacting with a lot of remote employees. It's just communication. You can't have someone who's working for you, 3 states away, and they're just getting a lot of dead air, focusing on tasks, but not really getting a lot of feedback or involvement from you. So it really puts a lot of increased burden on those employees, direct managers, but also other people in the organization to be reaching out to those remote employees and keeping them engaged and making sure they're getting a sort of steady stream of information and talk and chatter from headquarters, so to speak. One idea that one of our integrated clients has started using is they've implemented a bingo game And I don't have the specific details on there, but they talked about there are some requirements in this game that actually specifically require people to reach out to and talk to employees that wouldn't be part of their, their sort of direct kind of work-related chain of communication. So to kind of replicate that sort of, oh, maybe you and I work in completely different compartments, but we're using the same lunchroom or stopping at the water cooler to talk to each other and introduce each other and get to know each other. Sort of they have this game they've implemented that sort of tries to recreate some of those features and get people talking, across silos, across departments, people who work for different managers and on different projects, still communicating with each other. And that's one way they're using, remote work as a way of still instilling their company's specific culture into people, and getting people to really feel part of a team that encompasses the entire company instead of just, maybe their specific project or, their manager and two direct coworkers. Another company we talked to has actually implemented having a manager that is specific to remote employees. And that's actually an idea I really sort of like. It's not going to work for everyone. But I think one thing we tend to not always remember when we talk about remote work, people working either, hybrid or, across like many states, not every manager reacts to having remote employees the same way. And we tend to have a very sort of, well, like what's going on with the employee focus, who's out there and working from home and who's not in the office with us. We also need to think about how our managers are handling remote work. And some managers are a lot better at handling the complications that come with managing remote employees than others. So maybe you have one manager who's really good at handling people in the office, and another manager who's more skilled at handling remote employees. You can sort of do this setup where, the remote employees are answering to the manager who's better at handling remote employees, and the in-office workers are responding to the manager who's better at handling, in-office employees. So that's one idea I heard that I thought was a really creative solution to sort of addressing this and thinking about it in terms of, not just, getting the most out of employees, but getting the most out of my managers as well.
And I think that you see that, typically you might have management that did, per project or an industry, and there's nothing that says you can't matrix, but having their direct manager that's really responsible for keeping them connected to the company is someone that works and handles that environment really well. One of the other things we did here too was that where you have company meetings, and often, and it happens at our office, we have people that are remote and we have people that are in the office. And so you have a company meeting and there's, maybe 75% of the people are in a room together, but then there's a few people that are, or 20% of the people that are all doing the meeting remote. And so they tend to not be as involved in the meeting, because there's a large group of people that are together. And so one company has switched that because they have remote employees now, all employees, when they have a company meeting, dial into that meeting or log into that meeting remotely. And so that, the entire staff is on camera and remote, and everyone is in exactly the same position. And you don't have that cross of, well, we're building teamwork together because we're here physically, but you're isolated and not necessarily having the same impact. And we have heard of, the bingo game was an interesting suggestion, but we also have people that are doing other types of projects or office projects or company let's say, company building, as opposed to, projects that are outside of the company for customers, where they engage together, and they might not necessarily work together. And, they provide small gifts to those groups that put those, ideas forward for the company. And again, people that normally wouldn't work together are working together, and, they're getting a thank you from it as well. So there were a few other items that came across with it. Everyone challenges our training, onboarding, development, and culture. At the end of the day, there's no panacea. You can't just, we've done this one thing and now it's all going to work for us. This actually creates, new challenges and work that has to be focused on. You have to focus a lot of energy in a different manner from both an HR and management standpoint when you have remote workers, and it has to be done consistently. So we do have a best practices guide we can share with anyone. If you would like to get a copy of that, you can reach out to Jeff or I at ECBM. My email is gforbes@ecbm.com. Jeff is jforbes@ecbm.com. You could put a note in the Q&A and we will respond to you and make sure that you get a copy of that best practices guide if you would like to see it. And at this point, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them. I don't see anything in the Q&A at this point.
I would like to ask one question, and
Sure.
that is, we have talked about the direct employees. What happens for resources that are independent contractors that system integrators use? Do we have the same framework that Jeff was alluding to, making sure that we have all the compliance by the different states, or does that simplify the thing for the work for the system integrator?
That makes things a lot more complicated. Just the question of who qualifies as an employee versus who qualifies as an independent contractor can vary wildly from state to state. I hate to keep using them as an example, but they do sort of intentionally put themselves on the forefront of a lot of this stuff. California recently has been very aggressive about trying to end a lot of people who used to being classified as independent contractors and trying to reclassify them as employees. Someone who is an independent contractor in most states under California law might be considered an employee. So that's the first step, is just, man, do this person who's always been an independent contractor, this position I've always used like it's an independent contractor, now that I'm operating and hiring people in different states, are they even still an independent contractor? Whereas just the fact that they're in a different state now changed them into an employee. That's the first step. When it comes to other types of questions you would raise with an independent contractor now that they're remote, as opposed to someone who's maybe a little more geographically close with you, it makes these questions of, you have to think about the questions about bringing them into teams and bringing them into office culture completely differently. Maybe you're the type of office that doesn't even think about that thing with independent contractors, and that's fine from one perspective, but it makes managing them a lot more complicated because you're still ultimately responsible for their work. So now that they're 3 states away, do you still have that same level of oversight into the quality of their work as you do If there's someone you're interacting with in a bit more of a direct way, where they're, coming into your office and hosting in-person meetings with you. If you are trying to integrate them more into your way of doing things, so that they're integrated in the project a little more, how are you doing that when you have even less control over them? It's a really complicated question, and some of it's going to be based off the relationship you have with a specific individual, and it might be a bit of a trial and error process. If there's someone you're going to be working with on a bunch of different projects, you might need to have a few kind of headbutting moments with them, quite frankly, before things are really kind of evened out. For someone you're just using on a one-off job, it gets really complicated to try and answer these questions. And you just kind of have to do the best you can. Some people are going to do better with a more direct oversight, a lot more communication, but a lot of people who are independent contractors because they like having the freedom to do things their own way. And to them, that's the big benefit of having that designation and working in that style. So, finding that happy medium between, integrating them into your company's way of doing work and doing business, while giving them the freedom to do things the way they want to do them. That's a balancing act with anyone who's an independent contractor, but it's the challenges posed by it when you're working in a remote environment. The employees on your team they're working with are remote, and they're remote, so you can't even bring them into the office to have some FaceTime, everyone sit down and we're just going to have a conference and talk these things out. I think we've all shifted to using Zoom or Teams or these video conferencing softwares a lot, and they provide a lot of really useful connection with people, but it's not always the same as having an actual face-to-face talk with people. And I think we have to adjust for those complications when we're having these conversations.
We did get, I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. We do have a few questions, so I want to get to those. One question comes to us, and are there additional concerns for remote international employees? So someone might be working in Canada, or that was the specific example. Are there additional concerns there? And so, if that person is an employee and they are, a citizen, and they are working remotely in another country, you have to be as aware of, let's just say it's a step up from worrying about whether or not you've got them, you've met New Jersey's requirement or you've met Florida's requirement. You have to be cognizant of what the laws are from an employment standpoint in another country. And so now, you've entered into the realm of international law. It's complicated enough I'm in the US and there's 50 states. Now I've gone and I'm dealing with international law on some of these issues. And that certainly does, complicate at least the legal and the compliance issues, not maybe so much make that much difference on the cultural side, other than being aware of, there's always cultural differences, right? From country to country, there's cultural differences. And so, you need to be aware of those when you're integrating them into your culture. But, from a legal and a compliance standpoint, you do have to be aware. Canada has a system of, a different workers' compensation system than the United States does. It replicates more of what you see typically in Europe because of, a socialized medicine or a single payer medical system. You don't end up with workers' compensation, you end up just with employer's liability. So it does make some changes. Another question that we had is, what do you do when you have a single employee, but they work remotely from 2 different locations? Snowbirds, right? I'm in the north, and we have snowbirds. This is the perfect time of year for snowbirds, right? So I've realized that, you know, I can go to Florida and work for 5 months or 6 months. You know, does that complicate this situation differently?
From a workers' compensation insurance perspective, the easiest way of handling that is probably splitting their payroll between the two states. So if it's going to be a 50-50 split, just cut their payroll in half and put half of it in Minnesota and the other half in Florida, for example. Other challenges that can present is it probably doesn't change how you're managing them that much. You just really need to make sure they're doing what they need to do to make sure their technology is in place at both locations, so that they're not having a big productivity drop off, you know, when they spend their winter months in Florida or Texas or somewhere where it's warm. You know, you don't want, you know, if they've got like a dual screen and a super fast internet connection on all these bells and whistles 6 months out of the year, and the other 6 months, you know, they're basically working on a tiny little laptop, you know, that, you know, has like 1/3 the processing power, and they're on a really poor internet connection, that's going to cause a host of issues. So that's probably a conversation you need to have with that employee, you know, kind of at the beginning of the process, where it's like, hey, you're fully allowed to do this, but we need to make sure that we're not getting half the quality of work from you the 6 months you're in one of these locations.
And I think
So making sure there's some sort of standardization there, you know, between their technology at both locations, is probably a step you want to take early in that process.
And I do think that you want to, with that employee, from the standpoint of other employment law issues, kind of determine a designated, you know, this is my state of domicile. So, you know, I have my lead state. Some people, for lots of reasons, change their state of domicile to Florida if they possibly can, because there's tax implications and liability implications. And if that's going to be their main state, then you want to know what state they've declared as their, you know, state of domicile, because then that is that probably going to direct where you want to, you know, make sure your compliance is made out of. And that's the next question was, you know, related to unemployment taxes that you pay. Again, where you're paying those wages, you know, the employee might live and move to Florida for a period of time, but if they've just designated themselves as a Massachusetts employee, you know, then you may be paying the Massachusetts wages all year long. And different states have, you know, arrangements that are that vary. So some states, you know, like the state of New York, if you drive through New York, you have to pay New York payroll taxes. And in other states, you know, they don't monitor that as closely, and they're not as, you know, they're, you know, not as demanding in that regard. And something like that is really going to be determined by what state you're paying their wages in. And I think that's probably handles most of those. Jose, you're muted.
Now I am the beginner here. So I want to thank you, Gloria and Jeff, for this great presentation. The topic is highly relevant, not just for system integrators, but everybody that is working. And the theme of our 2022 conference is the future of work. And the remote worker is one key component of this. So I invite you to register for our conference. And I would like you to also take a look at our calendar. We're starting to populate it for 2022. All these great presentations, make time in your calendar, make yourself available. This is a great way to stay updated in times when we cannot travel that much for trade shows, etc. And if you have any need to contact us, this is our information. So I want to thank everybody attending this event, and Gloria and Jeff. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day.